This video is on sellers and buyers remedies, and we'll start off with telling you what the basic remedies are, cataloging the basic remedies of sellers when the seller retains goods. The first remedy is, of course, cancel. One thing you can do is you can always cancel a contract. If the other side is in breach, you can cancel the contract. You can't cancel the contract, of course, unless he agrees to it or he's in breach. The next one is withhold delivery. If he's in breach, you can withhold delivery. This includes contracts in which there is multiple shipments, where every month they're sending a shipment. If they haven't paid for the last shipment, then you can withhold delivery of the current shipment. The third remedy is specific performance. You get that when you've delivered the goods, and you can demand the price for the goods. You also can resell or dispose of the goods and demand a standard measure of damages. If you're in retention of the goods and you're holding on to the goods, you can dispose of the goods. If he's not complying with the contract, you can dispose of the goods however you want. And then demand the standard measure of damages. This, of course, usually you're expected to resell in that situation, because you always have to keep in mind that damages are going to be limited to those damages that you can prove. You have to prove that you had an actual loss. If you resell the goods, of course, the thing is that whatever you got for the price of good is going to decrease and may even eliminate the damages. If you resell for the same price as he was supposed to pay, and there are no other damages, then there would be no damages. There might be coincidental damages besides, though. But anyway, the final one is recovery for lost profits. You only get that in one special circumstance, which we will talk about. Resale or disposal of repudiated goods. So if the buyer repudiates the contracts, says he didn't order those goods, oftentimes the most reasonable thing to do is to resell the goods, and even the preferred course of action is to resell the goods. Seller must be notified of defect of goods except where goods are rapidly depreciating. So if the goods are actually deteriorating, and that's the reason you're rejecting them, you have to notify them. And if they're rapidly depreciating, you may not have to notify them. You may be able to take other measures to eliminate them and dispose of them. We'll talk more about that later. The resale of goods must be executed in good faith and in a reasonable manner. So this is usually the preferred way of going about disposing of the goods that have been repudiated, that you haven't shipped, or you retained them, or he's returned them and you have them in your possession. You basically have to, in good faith, sell them. You can't have some sort of sweetheart deal with a subsidiary of yours or a friend of yours. There's got to be a reasonable price paid for the goods, basically, and that can be challenged in court if you don't get that. It's resale of unfinished goods. Now, you have a special situation where goods are being specially made, maybe for a buyer. It maybe being made to a specification. We could take the case of, say, it was a armored vehicle that some dictator wanted to, from some foreign country, wanted to have this armored car. So he wanted to take a nice limousine, and he wanted to buy that limousine, but he wanted the manufacturer to actually put in these armor plates and fortify the car, maybe with weapons and armor. So basically, you've got a good that has to be first, oftentimes, going to be seriously altered, even maybe cut in half, and actually panels taken on and put back on, and armor installed, and machine guns installed, and all these kinds of things installed to protect the dictator. And so let's say that they call up and they say that they're not going to accept the goods. They've changed their mind for whatever reason. What are you going to do with this car? Let's say you've actually substantially torn it apart, haven't done anything with it. There are two things you could do. You could complete the manufacture of the goods and resale or dispose of them as they were ordered, finding some other person who wanted an armored car, maybe perhaps. If you know of another person, maybe you could arrange a sale to this other person and use this car as the one. That would certainly decrease the damages, and you have always a duty to mitigate damages, meaning that you always have a duty to keep the damages down. And if in fact you don't sell them for the same price as the original contract were, you could sue the buyer or lesser for the difference in price, just as in the standard measure of damages. Or you have this choice. You could either complete manufacture, which of course would incur cost. You would only do that if you could sell it for a reasonable price. Or you could cease manufacture, scrap the goods, and sue for damages. In which case, what you're saying is that you don't think you can resell it if you actually, go through with the plans to fortify it. You don't think it's going to be resold. You've got all these parts, and so basically you can do that with any kinds of goods that you are making specially, and you want to either finish them and find another buyer. Maybe you find a buyer before you decide to finish them, or you could decide to scrap the whole project, sell it for scrap or whatever you can get. And of course, what you should do would be that which would be most likely to be most beneficial to both to you and to the buyer. The buyer, in every case, you don't know. You really don't want to rush into suing a buyer. You never know whether or not he's financially stable or not, and collecting may be difficult, especially if we're dealing with foreign countries. So you have to make the decision whether you should cease manufacturing, not sinking any more money into modifying this vehicle, or maybe you want to just put it together as the original vehicle was. That's another possibility, but that would be also kind of a completing the manufacture in a sense, but with different purposes. And so you have this choice with the unfinished goods you have to make. Either you're going to resell the unfinished goods when they're finished, or you're going to resell the scrap that whatever you can get for the scrap of it. And usually it's probably going to be better to complete the manufacture in some sense of the word. The standard measure of damage is used whether scrap or goods, whether you scrap the goods or you finish them. And of course, the standard measure of damages, as you remember, is the difference between the contract price and the market price. If the buyer breaches, then the seller is entitled to the difference between, you subtract the market price from the contract price, that would equal the damages. On the other hand, if the seller was one that breaches, then the buyer is entitled to have the contract price deducted from the market price, and that equals the damages. You can see all this on the PowerPoints, which we are not putting up just at this time, but you have those PowerPoints on the previous announcement, and you could run these at the same time and split the screen and run the video and have the PowerPoints up at the same time, and just go along and add to them as you want. So we're going to try it this way for now, since you've already got the PowerPoints, and since it takes us considerable time to do it, which makes it very difficult for us to get these things done in a timely fashion. So that's what standard measure of damages means in terms of that. So you have to keep in mind that for the buyer and the seller, they're on opposite sides of the coin, you could say. What you subtract from what? When you subtract the market price from contract price, or the contract price from the market price, it really depends upon which side of the transaction you're on. Resale of a house. Usually the seller will take the agreed upon damages in a resale of a house, but if he chooses, he can resell and demand the differences as damages. So the standard measure of damages is used not only in the sale of goods, but also in the sale of a house. His use of the standard measure of damages puts the seller into an uncertainty. Why? Because most sellers keep the escrow deposit. So usually there's an earnest money deposit paid down on a house that is to more or less be damages should the buyer breach the contract. So the seller can keep those escrow account monies, those earnest money deposits, in lieu of damages, which means he then will not be able to sue. If he decides he wants to sue for damages and get the standard measure of damages, he has to immediately return the within a reasonable time return the earnest money deposits, and then he can sue for the standard measure of damages. But there's an uncertainty there, isn't it? He doesn't know necessarily what he's going to sell it for at some later date. Maybe he'll sell it for the same price, in which case he has no damages. Or maybe he sells it for more than the price that he sold it the first time. Again, he has no damages in that case. The thing about it is, he also might have a lot of damages if in fact he's unable to sell it because the market went sour, you know. And so unfortunately, I guess if you're in the middle of a transaction and you're a buyer and things suddenly, and you realize that the price of the house that you're buying has considerably dropped because of economics, maybe, like in 2008 happened, you know, do you go through with the contract and pay more for the house than what anybody else would be paying at that time if they were able to negotiate? You're not able to negotiate. Or do you default, in which case they could actually sue you for damages and try to collect the difference in price there. That would be up to them. But in normal times, most sellers will take the earnest money deposits. Okay. Lost profits, available only where the standard measure is shown to be inadequate to compensate a volume seller for lost profits. Then he can sue for profits lost. So let's give an example of what we're talking about there. When can you get lost profits? Like I said, it has to be a volume seller. What's a volume seller? A volume seller is usually a retail store. It could be a car dealership. These kinds of stores are able to order new goods. So with the automobile dealership, he has cars sitting on the lot for sale. So he has a number of new cars on the lot for sale, and somebody comes in and looks at a particular car, doesn't want that particular car, but wants to special order a different car. So he orders some car that's different. So he's not buying one on the lot. When that car comes in, he comes in and he's changed his mind. He no longer wants that car, and he wants to get out of the contract. So he's refusing to go through the contract. Well, you know, he signed the contract, so he's got to go through with it in some sense, or pay, winds up maybe paying the lost profits. So ordinarily, in sale of goods, say a farmer has a crop of potatoes, he can't get a second crop of potatoes. He's selling his crop of potatoes to a middleman who's working for some grocery chain, and those potatoes are the only potatoes he's going to get. He's not like in a situation where you call up and order more. But the car dealership can order another car. So he orders one car for this guy. It comes in, it's sitting on the lot now. For the farmer, you would be able to, you know, the farmer would be able to sell his potatoes to somebody else, and get the difference in price between what he got for the potatoes and the difference that the agent for the grocery chain was willing to pay for those. He would get that standard measure of damages. That's easy enough. But his situation is different because he cannot get lost profits. So the automobile dealerships oftentimes want to get lost profits. For one thing, they usually compensate their salespersons by the sales that they make. And if he made a sale, then it's not his fault that the buyer didn't maybe go through with it, and he should still get his commission. And so the dealership wants to collect for a lost profit. And the argument is that, well, you know, we did wind up selling the car, perhaps for the same price or even a higher price. We ought to be able to collect for our lost profits. Or maybe we sold for a price that wasn't quite the same, but still the lost profits would have been for 2 sales, and so we should have had profits on 2 sales. And that being the case, we ought to be able to collect the lost profits. It's inadequate to really cover our loss because we lost a profit in one of the sales of that car. whereas we could have ordered a second car just like it for that second buyer. And so that's the argument for lost profits. And so you can only get it with those volume sellers. That is, of course, sellers who can call up their supplier, whether that's a manufacturer that they're somehow connected to, or whether it's a third party. They can call up the supplier and then get more of those products, so they can claim a right to lost profits. Okay. Seller's remedies 2. Now we're going to talk about when goods are in transit. So sometimes the goods have already been shipped out, so they're no longer sitting in the warehouse or the factory of the seller. They're already on the way to the buyers. What do you do when the buyer perhaps anticipatorily repudiates the contract, or otherwise you become aware that he's not going to go through with the contract? Well, one thing you can do is, of course, stop delivery. Have the goods maybe returned. Stop delivery until he has satisfied you that he's going to pay, so you can demand that he give you reasonable assurances that he's going to pay. That's what you would do in an anticipatory repudiation thing. You would make a demand for reasonable assurances that he's going to pay for the goods and accept the goods, where he's either indicated he wouldn't, or you have reason to think that he wouldn't be able to, for one of the reasons that, well, we gave you 2 reasons why you have anticipatory repudiations. And, you know, one of them is usually related to, one of the more common ones is related to payments. Has he not paid on a previous shipment? Therefore, you're wondering whether he can. How about if you know that he's in serious financial condition and you think that he will not be able to pay, that he'll go bankrupt? Therefore, you don't want to deliver the goods to him, right, and then have to wait to get the goods back from the bankruptcy trustee, which would be a delay. You would be entitled in bankruptcy to get the goods that you delivered to him, and you wouldn't have to like have them sold and get some sort of difference in price. You could actually reclaim those goods. So but the simplest thing for you to do, if you know this is going on, if you know there's a problem with his you know, payment for these goods that you're transporting to him, that are on the truck right now, or maybe they're sitting in a warehouse waiting to be picked up, you can stop the delivery of those goods, so he won't be able to collect them at the warehouse, and they won't be sent to him. The trucks will turn around, come and bring them back to you. The right arises when the buyer is insolvent, certainly, but also anytime he has given you reason to be insecure and demand reasonable assurances of performance. The right arises to stop if the truck buyer breaches and the shipment involves at least a carload, truckload, plane load, or a larger shipment. Okay. Timely, you can't stop a truck from making deliveries if he's still making a number of different deliveries, but he ought to be able to maybe not deliver your goods to him, but you know, sometimes it's difficult to get trucks to comply with that. It kind of depends also upon who has control over the truck, and that depends upon the bill of shipping. Timely notification must be made to the carrier or warehouse so that they don't, not knowing any better, allow the buyer to obtain the goods. And so that's when the goods are in transit. We didn't talk about when they get destroyed in transit. That's oftentimes going to come down to 2 questions: whether or not either party has insurance, in which case the insurance will pay, and the seller will get his money either from the buyer who collects from the insurance, or maybe directly from the insurer if the insurance is something that will pay him if the goods get destroyed in shipment. That's not on the PowerPoint. Seller's remedy 3. Goods in possession of buyer or lessee who is in breach of contract. You have a right to recover the purchase price, and we mentioned that before. You have a right to recover that specific performance. What are you entitled to as a seller when they have the goods? Well, you have a right to recover whatever was the agreed contract price, which is of course the purchase price of the goods. You have a right to. You don't have to, you know, demand the. And you actually have another choice. and that is a right to reclaim the goods. That is to demand that you be able to go in there and pick up the goods or have them shipped to you. You have a right to do that. And you would want to do that clearly in cases where there's insolvency. Would want to go in there and maybe collect these goods so that you would not have to wait for the bankruptcy trustee to approve your getting the goods. Right to reclaim. Ordinarily, the right must be exercised within 10 days of receipt of the goods. That's ordinary circumstances. Obviously, there are special circumstances. I think any time he has filed bankruptcy, you would be able to immediately collect the goods. But if there's some chance that he will be able to pay, even though it might be doubtful or he's not been actually paying on time, you want to exercise that demand for the return of the goods within that 10 days. If the buyer misrepresented his solvency, then the seller may claim it at any time. So if he's been lying to you about his solvency, so you call him up and you've heard rumors that he's having difficulty paying bills, maybe you experienced some of that yourself, and he reassures you that there's not a problem and that he's financially solvent, that will extend your time beyond the 10 days. Seller cannot reclaim from a bona fide purchaser who purchased the goods in the ordinary course of business. So you see this in some scams where some criminals take over a bankrupt business, a business that is insolvent and is sold by the seller, and the seller doesn't care. He just sells it to these criminals, and they have a fire sale, a going out of business sale, and they sell the goods that are in their inventory cheap, and in their inventory are also goods that are belonging to various manufacturers and various middlemen who have a claim to those goods because they were not fully paid for. So they were shipped maybe with terms where there would be a down payment, and then the rest of it would be paid within 30 days or something, or upon sale. They're on a consignment perhaps. You take a jewelry store, most of the goods in jewelry stores are oftentimes on consignment. Now if some criminal got a hold of that and just came in there and sold all the jewelry store at very cheap prices and sold it all real quickly, he might be able to walk away with a sizable sum because he's not going to pay the price. He's not going to follow the rules because he's going to take the money and run, so to speak. He's going to disappear with the money, and so he's not intending to maybe turn that money over to the manufacturer or the middleman who has a claim to those goods until they're sold. And at that time when they're sold, he's supposed to get whatever the price is for those goods. The seller reclaiming goods will have a preference over other creditors. If it does come down to a bankruptcy situation, you will have, since you have delivered those goods in good faith and not actually receive payment, you will have a right to reclaim the goods, except from a bona fide purchaser. Now, so what's a bona fide purchaser? It's also called a good faith purchaser. Bona fide is Latin for good faith. And a bona fide purchaser is, say there is this jewelry store that's been taken over by these criminals, and they're selling these goods at rock bottom prices, just real cheap, just to get them out of the floor. You go in there, you can negotiate a really good price with these people because they're not intending to pay for the goods that they are selling. And so those people, those consumers who buy it, they don't have any idea that there's some criminality involved in the sale. They don't realize that they're receiving stolen goods, in effect. And therefore, they wouldn't ordinarily get good title. But in cases like this, where a bona fide purchaser purchases something in the ordinary course of business, so if this is a business that's been in business for some time, then they have a right to expect that it would continue in business until such time as it becomes obvious that they're no longer owned by the same thing. So, the fact that it's going out of business, that's not necessarily indicating that it's not in the ordinary course of business. You have chains that go out of business, and chains that go out of business, we all know that when Sears was going out of business, there were stores that were being closed, and they were having going out of business sales in those stores, and yet the Sears company was not going out of business, so there was still going to be a company there, and that's a different situation. So it's still in the ordinary course of business, if as long as the buyers believe this is just an ordinary transaction, that's just a good opportunity maybe to buy things at good prices. So the seller reclaiming the goods will have a preference over other creditors, that is the banks that have maybe lent money to that jewelry store would have a lower claim than even bondholders, if there are bondholders involved, which probably the kind of store we're talking about will probably not be that structured that way capitally, but if there were bondholders involved, the seller reclaiming the good can claim them because as long as they're in that business, they're not there with title unless they've been paid for. So the title hasn't passed to the store until the goods are paid for. So as long as they've not been paid for, the manufacturer, the middleman, still has title to those goods and can reclaim them and have preference over other creditors. So if you're a creditor, you need to always take a careful look at the inventory. It's not a matter of just simply knowing how many cars he has, and what kinds they are, and what kind of prices they would usually sell for. It's more than that. You have to also understand how they were obtained and what is his right to those cars. Has he got title in? Seller reclaiming goods will have preference, like I say, over other creditors. Right, okay, buyer's remedies. So we'll talk now about buyer's remedies. When seller or lessor doesn't deliver, the buyer, of course, like the seller, this is true in any contract. Anytime the other side is a breach of contract, you can cancel the contract and sue for whatever damages you're entitled to at that point. It's not always what you want to do. There may be other remedies you want to avail yourself of. You might want to cancel the contract and do some other thing. So you can combine remedies. What you can't do is accumulate them to get a higher value than what the goods or the thing that you're selling is worth. So you can't accumulate them and get some sort of bonus by combining different remedies. You can't like reclaim the goods and then demand the purchase price of the goods. You got the goods back, you don't get the purchase price. You can get the purchase price or you can reclaim the goods. You can't do both. But you can cancel the contract and maybe do either. The other thing that you would have a right to do is sometimes as a buyer to recover goods. You would get that if perhaps there was some kind of payment, even a partial payment of goods. You might be able to obtain the goods that were contracted for. If it's only a partial payment, you'll have to pay the full price, but you'll at least be able to get these goods that you ordered. The trouble may come in is, do you really want to get them, and how long is it going to take to actually get it going through the courts? You might have to go through a court or a trustee in bankruptcy, and there may be delays in order to get the goods, but you can reclaim them, and you could use expedited measures to try to get them sooner rather than later. Right to recover goods is one of the buyer's remedies, where the other side is not paying for the goods, hasn't paid for the goods, is in some sense breached his contract. Specific performance. Specific performance would be actually receiving goods. Now normally a buyer doesn't get specific performance except if goods are specially made. That is, if they've been specially modified, and therefore it would take a lot of time to get the goods from some other source. And so ordinarily what you're going to do is cover as a buyer. The right to cover is the fourth remedy that we were going to talk about next. The right to cover means you would go out and buy the same goods from some other seller who has them, and they have to be comparable goods. So you couldn't buy better goods and then claim the difference in price between two. So right to cover, you go out and you buy substitute goods, and you use a standard measure of damages, because you may have to pay a higher price for these goods, and recover the difference in price. And so that way you wind up getting your goods at the price that you would have expected to get. That's of course provided, of course, you are able to collect the money from that seller who didn't deliver the goods. And so specific performance would be actually ordering him to deliver the goods. You can do that with bankruptcy, perhaps, and in some situations. But you do it under a right to recover goods rather than specific performance. The specific performance to receive goods that we're talking about here would be blocked if these are, like I say, unless these are, of course, specially made goods. If they're ordinary goods, you can't force him to go through with the sale. He, in a sense, can break his contract. All he has to do is pay the damages. May not want to do that. And now there is one kind of buyer who has a right to specific performance when purchasing a house. A buyer who buys a house will have a right to receive the house. In other words, if the seller reneges and decides not to go through with the closing, which is of course the time when you close the deal where you pay for the price of the house and the seller gives you the deed, if that's the case, you would have a right to actually get deed to the property. Of course, you have to pay for the property, but you get specific performance. In other words, you get that house that you want. Now, why is that? Because a house is always a special thing. It's got a special location. It's the only one maybe at that location. There's a house next door to it, isn't the same. If you buy the house next door, it still isn't the same. It's just next door, but it's that much further away from the bus stop, or it's somehow different than this house. Enough different that it really makes a difference to a lot of buyers, and therefore you really have to wind up buying substitute goods. If you buy goods that are better than the goods that you were being bought, you would not be buying substitute goods. So right to cover applies to any goods, and a right to specific performance means that you have a right to actually get those goods that you contracted for. And you would want to do that if these goods were specially made for you. If it were a tailor-made suit, or you were a manufacturer and you needed a certain part, and it had to be manufactured to certain specifications, and other manufacturers don't have this kind of thing laying around and would have to modify goods to create something like that. Okay. And so you have a right to replevy the goods, and you must show unable to cover if that's the case. Replevy, again, is the right to recover the goods, maybe that are in transit. Right to cancel and reject. Cancel requires reasonable notification of seller. So anytime you're going to reject, if the goods have been delivered, the buyer must show they were non-conforming. The seller has a right to cure where it is reasonable to do so. Buyer in good faith must mitigate damages and respect the buyer's right to the goods. Now, let's say you have you have a sale of sprinklers by a plumber, and he guarantees to the, as an example, he guarantees to the buyer that he will come out and fix any sprinkler that doesn't work within 24 hours. Now, the reasons the orange groves used to buy sprinklers was to avoid freezes. If the weather suddenly changed and their oranges were going to be lost to a freeze, they would turn on the sprinklers, which would save the oranges. And of course, now if your sprinklers didn't work, you'd want somebody out there to fix it. And since other orange groves might be having similar problems, plumbers might be in high demand. Therefore, if you had, when you bought these sprinklers, you got a promise that they would be fixed under a service contract, you were probably going to pay extra to get that, and the plumber is obligated then to do so. If he's unable to do so because he's tied up with others already, he tells you can't come out, he's breaching the contract, and therefore you'll be able to sue him for the differences. What should you do in that case? Well, you always have an obligation to mitigate damages, so what you want to do in that case is go out and find some other plumber to do it and cover. That is, go out and cover by finding a service from some other plumber and maybe paying a high price to have some plumber fix it so you don't lose the oranges, which might be actually a greater loss than the actual amount that would have to be paid by the plumber. Do you really want to sue the plumber? What if other people are suing too, and what if he doesn't really have the kind of money to back up his guarantee? He obviously didn't have the manpower to do that, And so, you know, generally, having a right to sue is one thing, but whether a suit to claim damages is efficacious is another. And so it might be that you're suing somebody, but he hasn't got any money to pay, so you can't get blood out of a turnip. And so that right doesn't mean too much in that situation. There's another case involving example. There was this shipment of wheat, and when it came into the station where it was being delivered, the buyer went down and he looked at the wheat and he discovered that it was infested with boll weevils, and half of the wheat was maybe already gone. And so he immediately notifies the seller and tells him that he's not accepting the wheat, and asks him what to do with it. Because when you reject the goods, you have an obligation in good faith to cooperate with the seller until you have to ask him what you want to do with it. And he offers him a way to decrease his damages. So he's thinking about how the damages could be mitigated, and he says, I can sell this shipment of wheat, which is largely depleted and contains even now boll weevils, to some chicken farmers, and they'll pay not much, they'll pay some money for this wheat. If I ship it back to you, that's another option. I could ship it back to you. If I ship it back to you, by the time it gets back to you, there may not be any wheat, there may be just the boll weevils. And so what do you want me to do? You'll have to pay, if I ship it back to you, you'll have to pay delivery, and I can give you statements from the railroad station attendants here that in fact it is infested. If you want that, or you can send somebody down, but you better come quick before it all disappears. And so this is one way of helping the seller out, and you are expected to do that kind of thing as a buyer and to cooperate with the party you're dealing with in good faith. Okay, so acting as a seller agent, he could sell the shipment to chicken farmers who would use the remaining wheat as chicken feed. Note, rejecting the buyer must notify and has good faith duty to act to mitigate the damages where he can do so, where it's reasonable for him to do so. Buyer's right to recover. The following requirements are met. Buyer can demand recovery of goods. Partial payment made. Seller became insolvent within 10 days of receipt of first payment. The goods had been identified to contract. That's required in both of these cases. So there's two cases, one where partial payment was made and they haven't paid, or where the seller has become insolvent within 10 days of receipt and therefore is not likely to pay. The buyer or lessee tenders unpaid balance due. So you can't get the goods, you can't recover the goods without, of course, paying for them. You're either getting the goods or you're claiming damages. And in this case, you might want to claim the goods because the payment is maybe not likely if he's insolvent. And that may be the case if he's not paying bills on time. Right to cover, the fails to deliver. Goods must be bought and substituted. Buyer must act in good faith and without unreasonable delay, because the price of goods will change over time, and therefore a lot of times prices will go down as time passes. That's certainly true with a lot of goods that become dated. This year's computer is last year's computer next year. Standard measure of damages is used again. Although the buyer or lessee is not required to cover, failure to do so may prevent recovery of consequential damages. Consequential damages are damages that would have been avoided if you went through a contract. So if these are goods that had to be shipped, one of the consequential damages would be if you contract with another, even getting the same price, you still got to ship the goods. So the shipment of the goods would be a consequential damage. You wouldn't have to pay for 2 shipments of goods if they'd sent the right goods in the first place. So they sent non-conforming goods, the wrong goods. You reject them, they get sent back, and you order goods from some other seller who then you have to pay for delivery, or perhaps you incur delivery costs if you pick them up yourself. And so you would get those as consequential damages. There are other kinds of consequential damages. So indirect damages associated with the sale. Although a buyer or lessee is not required to cover, so we always talked that way. Did that line. Okay, these are practice questions. These are true-false questions that are on the last slide. You've got those, and so you'll be able to answer those. So I'm not going to tell you the answers to these questions. I want you to think about these questions because I think it'll help you if you do so. And you know, if you need to go and you can go into the PowerPoints or you can replay this video to answer them, you're certainly welcome to do so. So one of the things about creating a long-term memory is that you have to have certain repetition, and this will help you remember it for the test and also help you remember it later in life if you are in business and these situations come up. Okay, the first question is, seller must be, the first statement, this is a true-false statement, seller must be notified of defect goods even when the goods are rapidly depreciating. True or false? So you should be able to know that. Usually, I think one of the first, if not the first slide, certainly one of the first slides we talked about that. Second question, a seller or lessor confronted with an anticipatory repudiation of unfinished goods may not complete the manufactured goods and resale or dispose of them. Again, that's in the PowerPoint we talked about in the lecture. You probably know the answer right off the top of your head. By us repeating it now, it's more likely that you will remember it later. That's why people cram for a test, isn't it? But actually, it's oftentimes a good idea to do it immediately after. They say to review after you've heard it, and maybe the next day do it again, then maybe a week or two later do it, and then do it after 3 weeks. And you know, by that time we're talking about almost a test, and obviously you want to do it before the test. Okay, so that's the third true-false statement is the difference between contract price and the market price is a non-standard way to determine damages. Okay, should know the answer to that. A goods in possession of a buyer, lessee who is in breach of contract, the seller has a right to recover the purchase price or a right to reclaim goods. So the goods is in possession of the buyer, and you know the buyer is in breach of contract, probably meaning he hasn't paid, but maybe some other term of the contract. The seller has a right to recover the purchase price, or he can reclaim the goods, so he has a choice. He can't do both, though. When seller or lessor, he might be able to reclaim some of the goods and add demand price for other goods. Certainly if the goods are damaged while in possession of the buyer will have to pay for them. Or if the buyer sells them, he's got to pay for them. When the seller, or the last question, the fifth question is, when the seller or lessor doesn't deliver, the buyer can cancel but must mitigate damages and respect the buyer's right to the goods. True or false? So these are true-false questions, and that's the video for tonight. Thank you very much.